have a cross-section of the spinal cord. You can see in the center we've got what we call the gray H of the spinal cord. There's a ventral horn, a dorsal horn, and a lateral horn to the spinal cord. The lateral horn is only present in the thoracic spine. The gray part of the spinal cord, if you remember, is where we have the cell bodies of neurons that do all the electrical processing for the nervous system. All of the white matter that surrounds the gray H of the spinal cord is where we have our highways of information, all those myelinated axons that are carrying motor information down from the brain or sensory information back up to the brain. Now you notice that we have these little rootlets on both the anterior and dorsal part of the spinal cord. These rootlets are going to merge together to form roots. So these little roots are going to merge together to form trunks, and then the trunks are going to branch. So branch in Latin is rami. We have a posterior ramus and an anterior ramus. Now when we look at a spinal nerve out here on the outside, it's going to be mixed. There's both sensory and motor axons contained within that nerve. But as we move in a little closer to the spinal cord and we hit our roots and our rootlets, we're going to have purely motor and purely sensory pathways. The motor information is going to leave out the anterior horn, or the ventral horn, and the sensory information is going to go into the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. So for instance, the brain will send a signal down the white matter of the spinal cord to the particular level of, say, C6 or so in your arm. That axon is going to move sideways. It's going to go into the gray matter of the spinal cord, and it's going to synapse with one of the cells in the anterior or ventral horn of the spinal cord. And then that postsynaptic neuron is going to go through those anterior rootlets into the spinal nerve and eventually end up on a neuromuscular junction somewhere. If we're doing sensory information, that sensory info is coming along our axon. We have our cell body in the posterior rotor dorsal root ganglion, and then the axon will continue into the dorsal horn of the spinal cord, and it's going to synapse there with the cell body, and that axon is going to jet out to the side into the white matter and then ascend up to the brain and go up to the thalamus. That's our second order neuron, and then our third order neuron is going to go from the thalamus up to the somatosensory cortex. If we look at the vertebral column from the side, you can see that the intervertebral foramina, the holes where all the spinal nerves exit, is partially made from each vertebra. If the disc starts to have problems and starts to shrink, that's going to close down on the intervertebral foramina. Or if we start to have osteophytes or arthritis in this area, then we're going to have bone spurs poking directly onto those nerves. Here is in a transverse section. You can see our dorsal root, our anterior root, the trunk, and then the rami. Now remember, the dorsal ramus and the ventral ramus have two completely separate sizes. The dorsal ramus is very small because it's only going to feed what we call the epaxial muscles, whereas the ventral ramus is going to basically innervate everything else. We have a little bit of space in here that we call the thecal space, and you can also see that we have an epidural space, and that area is not free-floating. There's fat packed into there, so your spinal cord's just not kind of banging around inside of there. Here we've got the three layers of the meninges that are covering the spinal cord. We've got the dura mater on the outside, the arachnoid mater, and then the pia mater is that single layer of simple squamous epithelial tissue that we have directly on top of the spinal cord itself. You can see we've got these little rootlets that are going to emerge at every spinal level, combine to make our spinal nerve and go out into the body. If we're going to do something like a lumbar puncture, then you don't want to stab it in the cervical or the thoracic region because the spinal cord is one big chunky cable at that point, and you're going to hit it with a needle, pretty much guaranteed. On the other hand, if we go down below the level of L2 and we hit the cauda equina, then we can go ahead and do a lumbar puncture down there, and the chances of hitting anything super critical is going to go way down. Remember, the gray matter of the spinal cord consists of the posterior dorsal horns, the anterior or ventral horns, and then the lateral horns that we find only in the thoracic spine. The gray commissure is the little band of tissue that connects the two larger portions of the gray H of the spinal cord. And anytime we have a collection of cell bodies within the central nervous system, that's called a nuclei. So we've got sensory nuclei in the posterior horn and motor nuclei in the anterior horn. If we look at it thematically here from the side, or on a transverse cut, I should say, we have our sensory information coming into the posterior side and synapsing here with little cells, which will then usually go sideways and then ascend through the white matter up to the brain. Here we have our motor information synapsing on our anterior horn cells and then going out into the body to neuromuscular junctions. We can also have, since this is the central nervous system, some interneurons, small neurons connecting the sensory and the motor pathways. The white matter of the spinal cord is divided into sections. We have some fairly big sections called funiculi: the posterior funiculus, the lateral funiculus, and the anterior funiculus. The posterior is mostly containing sensory tracts. The lateral funiculus contains both sensory and motor, and then the anterior contains both sensory and motor. Here you can see the funiculi and the tracts within them. You do not need to know this for the test. This is just for an example here. But the spinal cord is very, very highly organized. You can see all these red areas here, and these are descending motor pathways, and then the blue is going to be ascending sensory pathways. One way to keep this in mind is to look at the name. We're always going to go from where the tract started to where it's going to. So the spinothalamic tract is going from the spine to the thalamus, therefore it's going to be sensory. Now, sensory pathways are going to use 3 neurons in a chain to go up toward the brain. We have a primary or first order neuron, a second order neuron, and a third order neuron. Motor pathways, on the other hand, use a chain of 2 neurons. We have an upper motor neuron and a lower motor neuron. The upper motor neuron is going to go from the primary motor cortex to the anterior horn of the spinal cord, and the lower motor neuron is going to go from the anterior horn out to a neuromuscular junction. Now, as we look at the rami, or branches, off of the trunks, remember the posterior dorsal ramus is very, very small. It's only going to innervate a few muscles of the back and some of the skin, whereas the anterior ramus is going to innervate all the rest of the muscles of the back and all of the anterior musculature, including the limbs. Now, in the thoracic spine, we do have some special rami called the rami communicantes, which are small branches of the autonomic system that we'll talk about here in a little bit. But here's a great picture of our posterior and our anterior rami. The posterior goes back, does just a couple muscles of the low back and upper back, whereas the anterior ramus does basically everything else. Now, a dermatome is just an area of cutaneous sensation innervated by a spinal nerve. You don't need to memorize the map of all the dermatomes here. Just know what a dermatome is. For instance, if somebody had pain here on their lateral leg, it went across the kneecap in the front and down the medial side of their leg, that's really indicative of what we call the L4 dermatome, or all of the skin innervated by the L4 nerve root.